Welcome back to the McCoy Leadership Podcast, elevating your impact through valuable insights and conversations about leadership. Welcome back to another episode of the McCoy Leadership Podcast. Today we have the Honorable John F. Hillen with us. John has an amazing career behind him at this point. He's been the CEO, board chairman. He was a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, which maybe we'll dig into that one a little bit more because that sounds like some fun. And an award-winning professor, and now he's teaching strategy and leadership to people all over the place, and has recently had a book that has come out called Strategy. Excuse me. And John, with that, I'll let you give a little bit better of an introduction of yourself and maybe tell us a little bit of how in the world you got through all of those different things to end up where you are today.
Great. Well, thanks, Amos. You know, it's great to be on the podcast because I've had an odd career with four totally different parts of it, but the thread that runs through all of them is leadership. So I'm very pleased to be here because I know your audience is really interested in that dimension of life and accomplishment. So I started off as a soldier, as an Army officer coming out of college. This was during the Reagan buildup and the end of the Cold War, and then I ended up sort of being in the middle of some salutary events. I was literally on the border, the Iron Curtain, when it went down in November of 1989. So I was right there. And got to witness, the tectonic plates of global politics shifting literally right underneath my feet. A year later, I was in the middle of Operation Desert Storm, and quite literally in the middle of the biggest tank battle since World War II. And then, so that introduced a whole new era of interesting things to me, and so on. I ended up going into business and loved it, was working on Wall Street, and 9/11 happened sort of right on top of me. I was 2 blocks from the World Trade Center on 9/11. So I ended up coming back into service after we wrapped that company up in New York City, and kind of culminated the public part of my career as an Assistant Secretary of State working for Condoleezza Rice when she was the Secretary of State. It's a very interesting time. I've been in 95 different countries around the world. I've lived, worked, fought, taught in a bunch of them, not just run through an airport. So it's been a very interesting life. And I've been the CEO of 3 companies, 1 public and 2 private. And now I'm dedicating this part of my career to teaching and writing. So I teach at Duke University, and I teach in the business school at George Mason University. And I focus on leadership and strategy, which are my 2 main topic areas.
Awesome. And, it fascinates me a little bit. And those that maybe don't know my kind of whole life story, the short version that I want to get to is, as a young man, I had this amazing opportunity. I worked at a feed mill, and there was a gentleman that delivered vitamins every 2 weeks, and I knew him as Mr. Winters. That was all I really knew about him. I knew he lived in Hershey, PA. And I was mid-teens. He handed me a book and said, hey, I finally got my book written and published. I was 14. I kind of stuck it on the shelf. Several years later, obviously, on television and in the movies, I realized the man that I knew was Dick Winters.
Dick Winters from Band of Brothers, immortalized.
Yes.
Yes.
And
yeah.
What I'm seeing here, he spent he continued at the War College for, many years teaching and talking about strategy. With your background, your book, The Strategy Dialogues, and what I'm really kind of curious about, can you share a little bit more deeper how those experiences as a young man that many of us today don't have any idea what that would be like, how did that help to shape your view and your thoughts on strategy and leadership?
Yeah, no, it's definitely connected, Amos, and what a cool experience for you. I'll have one fun fact before I answer your question, which is, among other things I've done in my life, I ended up being the military advisor on the original Call of Duty video game series set in World War II. And so I got a chance to interview a number of these veterans. Many of whom have since passed on, of course. And in fact, I play a character, my face and my name, in Dick Winter's unit, Company E, 1st of the 506th Infantry, 82nd Airborne Division, in a game called Call of Duty United Offensive. Every player has to run through a tent, and Captain John Hillen chews you out and shows you where to go. So I can really, and there's a fantastic statue dedicated to him over in Normandy. I always encourage all Americans to do a pilgrimage, frankly.
Yes.
To the Normandy beaches and the cemetery there. So this is all related because, I'm thrown into the middle of these events as a young man, as a young lieutenant, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the so-called Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, the emerging shape of a chaotic Middle East still with us to this very day, right? I mean, there's American sailors off the coast of the Red Sea in the middle of a fight right now, the same fight in some ways that I was in, 34 years ago. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? Because on the one hand, you're managing stuff in front of you, just like in your audience, right? Everybody's got stuff to do day to day, week to week, the life of a busy manager. The other hand, to think strategically means to pull back that lens and say, what's the big picture? What's the long term? And while managers seek to break problems down and solve them, strategists seek to see how everything interconnects. It's the opposite skill set. It's a different part of your brain you're using for thinking strategically than thinking analytically. So, when you're up sitting on your tank smoking a cigar in the middle of the night in the desert, as Desert Storm ends and peace sort of, kind of, I don't know, you tell me, emerges, one that would, was indeterminate enough to have us go back a decade later as a country, I thought to myself, how's this all fitting together? How do these pieces connect? How does history and culture and language and politics and national ambition and various players on the scene, how does this all connect? That's thinking strategically. So while strategy can be an unnatural act for a lot of executives, for some people it comes a little more naturally, and I just happen to be in that small minority category of people who kind of naturally think strategically. This makes us terribly not useful in problem solving sometimes, because we'll sit around and ask about what are the long-term implications of things when we should be solving something because it's due by Friday. So a lot of times managers get frustrated with people who naturally think strategically. But at the end of the day, every organization, whether it's a church choir or a big multinational company, wants their leaders and executives to be able to think strategically. So I was lucky enough to come on to that curiosity, exercising that muscle in my brain early in my career.
Awesome story. And I was thinking as you were talking, I believe it was Stephen Covey, but one of the leadership experts out there had told a story that, there was a group of people that were out in the jungle, bushwhacking, cutting down the jungle. And the one guy, about halfway through each day would climb up a tree and look around, and nobody quite understood what he was doing. And anyhow, the one day he climbed up the tree and he yelled down, "Stop, stop, stop." And everybody stopped, and they're like, "What?" He's like, "We're in the wrong jungle."
Right, exactly. He was a great example.
He was the strategic guy. Now, so many times when somebody says the word strategic or strategy, many leaders immediately, their mind kind of shifts to the mind-numbing exercise where somebody from the outside comes in and we talk about our strengths and our weaknesses, and we put sticky notes beside them, and we come up with a strategic plan. And that's not what you're talking about with strategic thinking. So how do we get ourselves to not go down that rabbit hole and really start to talk about strategic thinking?
Right. Well, I think the first thing for people to keep in mind is that strategy is a way to think, not a what to think. It's not a formula. It's not an answer. If you practice strategic thinking, it could and should emerge in a plan. That's great. A plan for your organization to probably do something a little bit differently in order to move into the future in the most advantageous way possible. I find it very hard. I've never met someone who disagreed with that. I'm like, do you want to move to a place of disadvantage in the future? You almost never get saying. So almost everybody agrees ultimately that it's a good thing to have a plan that takes into account all the different dynamics shifting in the environment in which your organization lives, all the internal dynamics of who you are and what you can do and who's on board and what sort of resources you can muster, and then put that stuff together and move purposely to a better destination for the future than if you stayed put. So that's the essence of what you get with a strategy. But you start by just thinking strategically. And one of the hard things for executives to grasp around this concept that it's a way to think, not a what to think, is that it's not like operations management or accounting or finance or supply chain or other things where you plug in the right numbers and you get the right answer. In strategy, there is no right answer. There's only the answer you give and how well thought through it is. So strategy is more situation dependent. It's more ambiguous than most other business fields. And yet at the same time, it's not an airy-fairy, dreamy, who's got the best idea game. It's a sound and thorough thought process. And I take people through that in the book, step by step by step, with like whiteboard summaries at the end of every chapter, and very deliberate. Because one of my premises, this goes back to your question, is I don't think you need to bring in somebody from the outside. If you can all train yourselves as executives to do what is expected of all executives, be able to think strategically, you don't need to hire an expensive outside consulting firm to figure out where you should go in the future. You can start talking about it, dialogues, and start thinking about it in a practical, guided way, and get to the kind of answers that will tell you where to go in the future and how to do it.
So, and I think you refer to it as the art of strategic thinking, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And so what about the person that comes up and says, John, I understand it's important, but my business, everything moves so fast. We're in technology and everything is constantly changing. I don't have time to be strategic.
Sure.
What are your thoughts to that person?
Yeah, I get, and I tackle right away in a book the common objections I get to people who say things. The conversation I usually have is people like, I get it. In the abstract, I understand you are correct. But you know what? I run a real organization around here, Hillen, right? I'm busy, as you mentioned, right? I do things. I get stuff accomplished. I am oriented on task accomplishment, which I would say is probably the principal dynamic of 95% of executives' lives, getting stuff done, which is great. I don't know how the world functions if people don't get stuff done. I'll hear a common objection of, especially from smaller enterprises, that's a big company drill, right? Everybody here works in my enterprise. We don't have time to sit around and stroke our chins and muse about the future and smoke a pipe, because that's the kind of image they have in their head when someone's thinking strategically. I also hear that it's too theoretical, right? It's too hard to grasp these concepts, which is why I'm at pains in the book to break them down to simple diagrams, simple thoughts, simple exercises, simple drills people can do, bring it out of the clouds and into your hands. So there's a lot of common objections. And I think part of them stem from the fact is it's misunderstood what it is. Strategy is not a goal. I was working with a public company. I said, what's your guys' strategy? They said, raise our stock price by 8% this year. I said, that's not a strategy. That's a goal. The strategy would tell you all the different ways you're going to connect a number of activities, many of which should probably be new activities, how they all interconnect, how they're sequenced, the dependencies within them, who's doing what, where the resources come from. The strategy's going to connect all those things, articulate them, and may result in an 8% increase in your stock price. But that's simply the goal. That's not the strategy. Or some people confuse strategy with that sometimes awful corporate drill of spending 2 days figuring out your mission, vision, and values, right? And with whiteboards posted everywhere on the wall and everybody getting frustrated that they just went to an offsite, which increased their workload by 2 days because now they got to go back to the office and answer all their emails, right? Well, mission, vision, values are really important, and they can inform us, but they're not a strategy, right? Aspirational things, culture, all really important and are part, but they're not the strategy per se. So strategy quite simply is a game plan and a blueprint to get to a point of advantage in the future. And even for people, especially for people whose external environment is changing rapidly because of advances in technology, changes in consumer behavior, permutations in the supply chain, whatever it is, they most especially need to think strategically, because you can let the future happen to you like the weather and just complain about it, or you can try to connect things that are happening in the future and move yourself to a place of advantage to confront it on your terms rather than simply letting it happen to you.
You kind of made me realize there, because of our earlier examples, and sometimes in a slightly different way, I tell folks and teach folks that there's really only one career path or one type of jobs or set of jobs that you don't know what you're going to do every day when you go to work, and that is doctors, first responders, military personnel, those folks. And what just hit me was, I think a way to kind of make people understand is those people's lives change on a moment's notice.
Right.
You're making your rounds as a doctor, and a gunshot victim comes in, or a heart attack victim, a stroke victim. I mean,
right.
Make it touch home. The point is, I really don't want a doctor that can't strategically think on his feet.
Right.
And so thinking about it that way, I heard you say that, a strategy are all the things and oftentimes new things. So one thing I guess I would ask on that note, so a new strategy is not taking all the things that didn't work this year and rearranging them and doing them again next year. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And Amos, you've put your finger on another reason I think people find strategy taxing, or what they want to. There's a lot of avoidance behavior out there when it comes to strategy. And one of the reasons is people confuse strategic thinking with strategic planning. And so the calendar rolls around to October every year, and someone says, "Oh, it's strategic planning time." Everybody says, "Yeah, okay, right, strategic planning time." Well, what they're talking about is their annual budget drill. They're not talking about thinking strategically. I call this corporate programming, not even strategic planning. And there's been a lot of stuff written. I have a whole chapter on it in the book to make it simple for everybody. But strategic planning can actually be the opposite of strategic thinking, because if it really is a thinly disguised annual corporate budget drill, it usually starts, to your point, from a baseline of last year's performance. Even if it's a really intelligent, good discussion like what worked last year, what didn't work, what should we reinforce, what should we drop, all that. But it starts from a baseline, and there's a desire to get the data. What's the data? What's the known data? Well, the known data is known because it's happened, and so that naturally starts to drag minds backwards to the known past, to the current present. Whereas strategic thinking is supposed to cast your mind forwards into the ambiguity of an unknown future, where you make really intelligent bets about the shape of your market, the shape of the ecosystems that influence your market, how they touch each other, where that's changing, and then where you want to be within that and what your enterprise is capable of doing within that. So there's an art of the possible, creative orientation of the mind in true strategic thinking and ultimately true strategic planning. Corporate programming, annual budgeting, and what 90% of enterprises call strategic planning is a drag your mind backwards to ultimately make modest improvements on last year's performance. Okay? That's usually not the strategy that will be remembered, that advanced the organization or transformed it. There's nothing wrong with modest improvements, but I tell leaders they should put that in their bucket of good hygiene. But thinking strategically is looking for a more transforming path, something new that's going to bring you into a position of advantage, hopefully sustained advantage in the future in a rapidly changing world. And it can be small things. These don't need to be massive, huge moves where you change industries or go from the bottom to the top in one move. But there's usually something new associated with a good strategy, and leaders need to think through what that should be.
So you mentioned several pieces there, a strategic planning session where maybe you're doing mission and values, and then your budget, of course, which all businesses, they need to do their budget.
Gotta have one.
They need to make sure that, they're thinking through that. And now we're talking about real strategic thinking. Is there an order to that? And what I kind of got in my mind is, a company throws their budget together and it says, oh, hey, we forgot to do our planning session or programming, as you called it. And so we're going to do that. And then we're going to do our strategic thinking. And so 2 questions out of that. Is strategic thinking something that we should be doing all the time or making time for? Or is it something that you do once a year, like the missions and the values? And then lastly, should you be doing it in a certain order, like ahead of budgeting, so that you can apply the proper funds to the proper places to actually activate the strategy that you've come up with?
Right. So I am not doctrinaire on the order of march, so to speak, here, because I think that can become an excuse for people to not do strategic thinking at all. So yes, strategic thinking should be a constant muscle on. It's like a security camera that's looking into your outside environment, right? Should I just turn it on when I expect the criminals? Right? Well, if you have that, you're clairvoyant. You really don't need one, right? It's got to be on all the time because stuff happens. And so the other corollary of this is if you're always thinking strategically, you don't let the calendar tell you when to refresh your strategy. The calendar shouldn't determine that because life doesn't happen according to the calendar. There may be some dramatic change, an economic change, a political change. I mean, think of people who are having to wrestle with some of the possible economic changes coming in the U.S. Right now, like in many other times of economic, turbulence or change. There could be a technology change. There could be a change in customer habits or social customs or social mores. There could be regulatory changes that dramatically upend certain industries. That stuff doesn't happen on schedule. It happens when it happens. And those are always cues. I have an expression in the book. Strategies are formulated outside in, but they're executed inside out. So you always take your cues from the external environment, then sometimes perhaps from some dramatic internal thing. You invented something. You lost a patent on something, right? So there's something happened that changed. So that's your cue to refresh the strategy. If you're always thinking strategically, connecting patterns of behavior in the universe in which you live, constantly assessing your own organization for what it's capable of in terms of new moves or no new moves, looking at what competitors, suppliers, buyers, customers are doing out there, following trends, you're prepared. This does not become a burden. It becomes a way of living. And you're prepared to refresh things, to throw new lines out into the water and fish in some new places. And if it doesn't work, pull them back in and move on. And it's just a rhythm of existence that's different than the annual planning. Gosh, I hope the world conforms to my schedule kind of way of living that most organizations do.
I'm picturing a newly married executive. His wife's pregnant. And, on day one, when she says she's pregnant, he says, well, when's this baby going to come? And he writes it in his calendar. And about 2 weeks ahead of time, she goes into labor and he's like, you're going to have to hold off because I don't have this scheduled until.
It's not scheduled, right? This recession was not scheduled. I'm sorry. It can happen now, right?
I often tell folks that all good things and bad things happen by surprise. Very rarely, do you plan for the life-changing things. They're all going to happen by surprise. So thinking about strategic thinking, the other thing that I'm kind of curious about, and I think many people would be, so I set a strategic plan, or excuse me, a strategy into place. I want to use the right terminology. And I've done my strategic thinking, and I have the strategy. Does it stay fluid? Is it living? Or do I have to stick to it because I just now got my organization going down this road, and we're going to go down that road no matter what? Or can it be adjusted as things? So the recession hits. All of a sudden, things change. A pandemic hits. Can you is that a time to come back, revisit, and continue strategically thinking, how do I come out of this?
Yeah. So I have a very, I told you that people are sometimes uncomfortable with strategy because it doesn't offer the precision of answers in accounting or finance. So I'm going to give you a very precise answer on this. It depends. Okay. And I always tell my students, and I'm teaching later this week, I'm teaching the core strategy course in an MBA program. I tell my students, you can always buy time in this class with the correct answer of it depends. So I mentioned it's situational dependent, right? So you have a new strategy in place. It's been really well thought through. And by the way, the process outlined in the book for thinking through this, which is very, you can kind of follow right along, follow the bouncing dots on the music, is about questions, not answers. If you ask the right questions about your organization, then you know what kind of analytical frameworks you should use to process information and data. And I have probably 40 of those outlined in the book. That process may give you insights, which may allow you to develop and analyze courses of action or choices you have, which then may give you a really good guidance about what kind of decision you should make. So there's a process of questioning that should be constantly ongoing through there. And this gets around to the answer. So now you have a strategy. You shouldn't stop asking those questions. So you build into the execution, and I have a whole chapter on execution. You build into the execution of your strategy the checkpoint. At the first month progress review of the new thing, the new strategy, the new trajectory, you pay someone in the meeting to ask, are our fundamental assumptions about the external environment still holding? If nobody asks it on their own, plant the question in the room, right? Are we still sufficiently resourced in the way we had planned for it to do this new thing, or have events taken us in a different direction, right? So you ask these things where you kind of check in on the process. The other thing all good organizations do that launch strategy is they launch a performance management tracking system to track. And I show a huge study of hundreds of strategies and what outcomes they achieved. And if your strategy leaks in its effectiveness, where the likely culprits are. So I've assembled a lot of data and research in there, and it's amazing. The same 5 culprits rob most strategies of their effectiveness. And they're very human things, unclear who was in charge of doing the new thing, under-resourced, vision communicated poorly, bureaucratic stovepipes resisted change, and so on and so on. So if you know all these things in advance, you can implement a strategy, be flexible with it when you need to be determined and gritty with it when you need to be, and also track performance along the way. So I think these are all, strategic thinking doesn't end with deciding what to do, because every executive should have a bias towards action. You're paid to get results. And so it ends with performance, not with decisions.
So what about the young leader, maybe just getting into management, and maybe they're in a bad, I don't want to say bad company, but let's say they're in a company that doesn't adhere to this. The company doesn't have a strategic thinking mentality.
Right.
Can they still exercise their muscle? Can they still work and learn? And what would be your advice to them, or with maybe some ways that they can exercise that, not being the leader at the top, but being a leader at the bottom?
Sure. And I think it's a really important point, because in almost every profession in any field, newer professionals are paid for and advanced in their career based on their ability to perform technical and tactical tasks. So for instance, if I hire 4 accountants into the accounting part of my company and as a cohort, the first one I promote in 2 years, or that the CFO promotes, is probably the best accountant, best accounting skills.
Yep.
Because they're all just doing stuff, exercising their craft. At the 4-year point, I may promote the best leader among those 4, not the best accountant. Because at that point in their career, as it is with every career, as soon as somebody gets put in charge of something or somebody, their ability to succeed depends on their strategic and interpersonal skills, not their technical and tactical skills. What I mean, strategic skills, where's this organization going and why? Interpersonal skills, how do I get people to work together to accomplish something? Okay, those are totally different skill sets than technical and tactical skills. And they need to be trained for differently. In the same way, if you went into the gym, you'd train for upper body strength differently than you'd train for, cardiovascular endurance.
Yep.
So you need to go to a different machine in the gym to train your strategic and interpersonal muscles. And I tell young professionals, start as early as possible because it's coming for you. It's the same. Even if you're in a highly technical field, the chief technology officer of a big technology company does not write a line of code, does not do any network and system design. They oversee dozens, if not hundreds, of processes and people doing technology. Their job is entirely strategic and interpersonal, even though they're a techie. So I tell people, this is coming for you, the strategic interpersonal world. You might as well get good at it early. Think about things almost like a strength finders test or something like that, right? They all have a field of executive competencies called, in the case of strength finders, strategic thinking, conceptual realms, things like that. We know every executive needs the capacity to think strategically in order to advance in their careers. So why not start early, even if that's not what you're judged on day to day? In my experience, newer, younger professionals in the meeting and in the room who ask questions with a strategic mindset are often viewed not as annoying, but as potentially people of potential. So instead of saying, hey, can someone remind me about how to get this report done by Friday? What they might say in the meeting is, we're going to get this report done by Friday, and I'm really happy to be part of the team doing that. What kind of decisions do we make based upon that report being done? Where does it go from there? Right?
Yep.
And all of a sudden the boss in the room will be like, whoa, mark for future promotion. This person's thinking outside of their cubicle. In my experience, good organizations don't find that annoying or disruptive. They see that as a sign of potential, as long as the person's getting their job done at the same time.
Now, I'm curious, you've traveled extensively. I believe you said you've been in 95 different countries. Through that travel and working with and living with and fighting against and with different cultures, are there any cultures or any areas of the globe that seem to have strategic thinking down better than maybe the rest of us? I'm just your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very funny dichotomy I've found in the world. So I spent a lot of time in Europe and a lot of time in the Middle East, and not and less time, but still a fair amount in Asia. I just got back from 2 weeks in Asia, in fact. The ancient parts of the world have far more context in the way they think, and thinking contextually is a big part of strategic thinking. What went before? What lessons could I learn from it? How do forces interact in the world? How they interacted? And the burden and the genius of the American way of thinking is, as a young country, we're unburdened by all this crazy ancient history. I was in a dinner in Beirut a number of years ago, and we were going to talk about like current events.
Yep.
And within 10 minutes, the baba ganoush had barely been served as the appetizer, and we were having an argument about who did what to whom in 1253. Right? So context can trap you and weigh you down too. And that doesn't tend to happen in the U.S., where we're so, in some cases, historically illiterate. We're also just a new country. We're always thinking about the future. And how do we go forward? It's a classic American characteristic. It has been since colonial times. How do I hustle and beat the next guy to the future? classic American characteristic. And so we don't have this world weariness of the ancient world. There's a reason the phrase "que sera, sera" is not in English and not an American lexicon, right? Oh, whatever will be, will be. This is a kind of European style of thinking. Oh, such is life. Americans don't say such is life. They're like, no, let's change life. And so I think it's an odd combination. Americans have the automatic, and I'm generalizing amazingly here, right? But I feel like I've earned the ability to generalize a little bit, having seen a lot of the globe and worked intensely in it. Americans do cast their mind forward. They do have an art of the possible thinking. It's the envy of the world. 7 out of the 10 biggest tech companies in the world are American. The other 3 are Chinese government owned. So maybe with some fake stats.
Yep.
So there's like no European tech companies, even in the top 20. And so entrepreneurs come to the U.S. to create because we do naturally cast our mind forward and think strategically about shaping the future. But another important part of being a good strategic thinker is understanding context. And I think the older bits of the world are generally better at that, even if it traps them in their own history sometimes.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I thought that I was just curious more than anything. As we're getting ready to come to a close, or before we go into our standard 3 questions at the end, I want to make sure we let our listeners know, one, where can they find your book, and where can they connect with you if they want to learn more about how to strategically think?
Great. Yeah. So my website is just my name, johnhillen.com. JOHNHILLEN. I imagine you'll post that in show notes and things.
Absolutely.
And the book, The Strategy Dialogues, is doing really well. It was blurbed by Patrick Lencioni and Marshall Goldsmith and Roger Martin, the great academic strategist, a bunch of CEOs, the CEO of Hillen, and a bunch of others. And so it's really practical. It's meant to help executives at every level tomorrow. And take all this theoretical stuff out of the clouds and put it right in your hands. So the Strategy Dialogue is available wherever you get your books. I think Amazon's, probably the easiest. I think a lot of reviews on Amazon from people and how they've found it. So I think that's also useful. So that's the best way to get a hold of the book or to see some of the other stuff I'm working on. A lot of it's on my website.
Awesome. So we always like to end with a kind of a little bit of a rapid fire session. And the first question, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, and really this question was derived out of all the conversations that I have with leadership experts, all the conversations I have with clients and prospective clients and businesses. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard somebody say a statement like, the kids graduating high school today don't have or don't know or don't understand. And I thought, what a great question to ask all the guests coming on. If we could magically have all the school administrators across the world sitting in front of us, what would be your one piece of advice to those school administrators of something they could add into a student's life or curriculum that will help them and aid them into the future?
Traditional, classic American civics, which is a fancy word for saying, how do things work around here? This country is a experiment in self-governance. One of the oldest questions in human societies is, how should we be organized and who runs what around here? Who makes what kind of decisions? Like who produces the phones and who picks up the trash and how does that all work? I don't even understand. Who decides who gets to park where and when tickets are issued? Oh, let's just think of all the little things in life. How did that all come about, right? So it's the oldest question in social and political order is who's in charge around here doing what and why? And the American answer to this 250 years ago was we're going to run our own stuff, which was a crazy answer historically at the time. And when it had been tried, it had failed. We're going to be self-governing. We're going to run our own stuff. And here we are 250 years later, and it's still working. And I would argue, having been around the world so much, it's working better than anywhere else in the world. We're very lucky to be here comparatively. So for the next generation of leaders to understand the key to self-governance, the difference between public America and private America, the difference, because we're a country with a government, not vice versa. Who does what within government? Who does what within industry? How do all these organizations, which largely are formed through voluntary association, come about, and what do they do, and how do they interact, and what are the rules that we've experienced, and how we had to work through when it hasn't worked? Like our Civil War and everything. When it wasn't working, how do we work through? How do we solve problems as a society? I think classic American civics, so that everybody knows how things get done around here and what is the root of all that, is really, really important. I think it will allow people to move forward with more confidence rather than thinking they have to reinvent the wheel and they're all encountering issues for the first time. I think this will bring us together as a society, because people have more of a common framework for why things are the way they are and why we do things the way we do things around here.
Awesome answer. Second question is, what is your go-to book throughout your life that has helped to shape your leadership and your thoughts, and that you continually go back to and try to glean more information from?
Oh, gosh, I'm a really wide reader. And in fact, I wrote a leadership book before this called What Happens Now. And in there, I suggest that leaders read fiction too. There's no management problem in your life you'll ever encounter that hasn't been written down in a short story by Chekhov. And so I tell people to read fiction. I tell people to read biography. So what do I go back to? The biographies of the founders, who I think have been unfairly and fashionably maligned a little bit of late, but I think are coming back because they took on a tremendous challenge, and they did it with the most extraordinary thought and study and interaction. If people were 1/90th as deliberate as they were and working through a lot of tough issues, we'd be better off. So that's a constant source of inspiration for me, and thankfully there's a lot of interest about it. You won't be surprised to know I read a lot of military history, comment on it, review it, and that's a source of wisdom and inspiration for me. And then I read fiction. A class I was teaching said, "You've been in politics and you've been in business. What are your two favorite movies that help with this?" And I said, well, I don't think there's ever a business problem I've encountered that you haven't seen confronted in The Godfather. And I said, I don't think I've ever encountered a geopolitical problem that you can't encounter in Lord of the Rings. So I said, that's all you need. You can go out there on the world stage and be a CEO and a statesman with those two movies. So I sometimes think similarly about the books and stories behind those.
Now, I got to pause just for a second. You'll enjoy this. I just recently was certified in a new training technique, and it was a sales training, and through that, in the middle of it, there was a little video they played, and they made a little light of, you can't just constantly offer somebody or make somebody an offer that they can't refuse.
Right.
And so anyhow, we got back to the group discussion, and they came to me and said, so what are you going to do? And I said, I think I'm sticking with the horse's head in the bed. But the part that hit me was, I looked around the room and everybody over 40 was laughing. And everybody that was under 40 was just kind of staring at me thinking, what are you talking about? A horse's head. So anyhow, I'm sorry. And the last question is, in the ever-changing world of technology and everything that's out there, what is your most useful piece of technology today?
Oh gosh, in some ways I'm trying to de-tech as much as I can. I am concerned about what technology has made everything extraordinary, but I'm also concerned about some of the pieces left behind. I'll give you one example. There was a big article in a national magazine a couple of months ago that my students, my Duke students give me. These are some of the brightest students in America. And the article was like how elite college students can no longer read a book. And it was a big study. So, as I mentioned, you asked me what I read for inspiration. You betray your own background by asking that question.
Yep.
Somebody perhaps under 30 would not say. They would say, what reels do you go to for inspiration? What's your favorite YouTube channel, Instagram site, whatever. And I'm not making light of that. There's some tremendous content-rich stuff out there. But it's different than asking a question, what books do you read?
Yes.
Right. And so I think technology is great. I think AI is going to be tremendous. There's going to be challenges with it, but we always conquer these challenges. And in general, I'm the opposite of a Malthusian, or all the people in the 70s, 80s who predicted we'd run out of oil and run out of food and run out of everything, right? We always figure it out because we're a creative, dynamic humankind. And technology is a huge part of that. But I also want as much attention paid to what I'll call some of the ancient ways of relationships, learning, and other things that seem to be getting left behind. The epidemic of loneliness within a highly technology-connected community, the epidemic of illiteracy. So I'd like these pieces to be connected without stalling like a Luddite the progress in technology.
Awesome answer. You it just give me some more things to kind of think about as well. John, it has been great having you on today. I hope maybe we can have you on in the future. It sounds like you might have another book or 2 or 3 in you. So maybe when the next one comes out, we can get you back on. I think we could unpack a lot more. I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you. Sounds great. Thanks, Amos. For our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to check out our past episodes and check us out on social media on LinkedIn, Facebook, and our website at McCoyLeadership.com. Till next time, we appreciate all of you.